In a time full of noise, just listen. 'Cause life is but a breeze, better live it. In a place that needs a change, make a difference. Whoa. In a world full of hate, be a light. When you do somebody wrong, make it right. Don't hide in the dark, you were born to shine. In a world full of hate, be a light. Whoa. כל אחד הוא קטן, וכולנו אור איתן. מעשו ישועתי, לך נאה לשבח. In a time for war, there's time for
What a beautiful song. Those guys are doing a great job. That's Keepa Live doing their song Be a Light. It's a Hanukkah song, but we're in the 9 days, and so it's important that if we listen to music, it shouldn't be instrumental music. How are you doing, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we do some wonderful learning? We got a big day today, a lot to cover. So let's quickly do a little bit of a roll call. Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina. Stephen in New Hampshire. Melissa in New York. John in Sedona. James in Indianapolis. Bill in Missouri. John in Maine. Pauline in Arkansas. Natalie in Portland, Oregon. Paula in Chicago. Mr. Sha'an from Faisalabad, Pakistan. Welcome, Mr. Sha'an. Renee in Indiana. Shannon loves the music. Stephen in Oklahoma. Bob in Canton, Ohio. Phyllis in Long Island. Paul in the Northwest. Wait a minute, skipping down on me. Janice in Texas. Adam in New York City. Nicholas in Portland. And Itai Aru in Mexico City. Bienvenido del DF. Over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas, Marjorie in Georgia, and Gigi in British Columbia. We had a question at the end of yesterday apropos of the discussion of the righteous convert to Judaism, Queen Helene, who lived north of the Holy Land in the late Second Temple period. She became a Jew. She had a sukkah. Her sukkah, because it was very grand, I'm sure she was a queen after all, she came to the Holy Land for Sukkot and built her sukkah in the city of Lod. And it was more than 20 cubits high, which we learned is the limit. It should not be more than 20 cubits high, according to the rabbis. Hers was, and apparently sages came and went, and they didn't correct her. So Rabbi Yehuda offered this as a proof that a sukkah can be more than 20 cubits high. That discussion is going to continue today, but one of our listeners asked, so is it so that a woman who lives alone is not obligated to build a sukkah for herself to dwell in during Sukkot? Why a woman alone? Because Queen Helene had sons who are obligated in the mitzvah of Sukkah. And that is the law. Women are not obligated in Sukkah. It is certainly praiseworthy for them to dwell in the Sukkah during Sukkot, but they're not obligated in it because it's a time-bound positive commandment. And the general principle is that women are not obligated in time-bound positive commandments. The question comes up, if they're not obligated, may they say the bracha? Can women say the blessing over the commandment to dwell in the sukkah when they are, for example, having a meal in the sukkah? And I looked that up. It's quite interesting that this is a divide in the Jewish world between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. So the Sephardic community follows the ruling of Rambam Maimonides, who says women don't say a blessing when they're dwelling or eating a meal in the sukkah, because the formula of a blessing over a mitzvah is, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to do such and such. So if women are not commanded, if they're not obligated to do that particular mitzvah, they shouldn't say the blessing. That's what Rambam says, and the Sephardic community follows him. Rabbeinu Tam says women may say the blessing because the blessing that they're saying is, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us," right? Commanded us, the Jewish people. So since women are included in the Jewish people, even if they themselves are not obligated, it is appropriate to say the bracha, the blessing. And that is the tradition in the Ashkenazi community. So that's an interesting division right there. Let's get back to this discussion. We're going to be doing 2 pages today. We're in the 7th volume of the Talmud, tractate Sukkah. These are the laws of Sukkot. We're in chapter 1 discussing the first Mishnah, and we're going to be doing pages 3 and 4 today. As always, not the entire pages, but important parts of these pages. And we're going to quickly encounter a very famous debate between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the academies of the sages Shammai and Hillel. But first, let's continue this discussion, this debate between the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda on, is a sukkah whose roofing is more than 20 cubits above the ground. It's very tall. It's 30 feet above the ground. The rabbis say taller than that. If the roofing is more than 20 cubits above the ground, this sukkah is unfit. And one who is inside such a sukkah has not fulfilled his obligation to dwell in a sukkah on Sukkot. Rabbi Yehuda would say that that sukkah is fit. And so Rabbi Yehuda brings this example of Queen Helene. And so now the Gemara explores the statements of the Amoraim who quoted Rav in light of this Baraisa, right? So the Amoraim are the sages in the Babylonian community, the sages of the Gemara who are arguing about what the sages of the Mishnah said. The rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda, those were sages of the Mishnah. The later rabbis are arguing about this. Now, granted, according to the one, Rabbi Yoshiah, who said that it is specifically in a case where the walls of the sukkah do not reach up to the roofing, that there is a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis about the height, right? So if the walls don't actually make it up to the roofing, that can happen, right? You can have posts, corner posts, that hold up the beams of the roof, and then the roofing material, let's say, for example, palm fronds, you have to be able to see some of the sky through the roofing material, but there should be more shade than sun coming through. But at any rate, the beams that hold up that roofing material could be held up by posts, and it can well be that the walls don't reach the roofing. So now the sages are saying, well, maybe this limit that it has to be within 20 cubits of the ground, whether or not the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda disagree on that might depend on whether the walls of the sukkah reach up to the roofing. So Rabbi Yoshiah, who said that it is specifically in a case where the walls of the sukkah do not reach up to the roofing, that we have a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. According to him, Rabbi Yoshiah, the Baraisa can be explained as dealing with a sukkah of that type, as it is customary for a queen, right? We're talking now about Queen Helene, to reside in a sukkah in which the walls do not reach up to the roofing, perhaps because she really needs a large sukkah. She's a queen. She's going to have a lot of people coming and going, and maybe she doesn't want the walls to get all the way up to the roof, and because she wants air circulation in this very large space that's going to have large crowds of people there due to the fresh air that circulates through the openings in the wall. However, according to the one who said that it is specifically in the case of a small sukkah that there is a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis on the height of the roofing, in which case the Baraisa is referring to a case where Queen Helene resided in a small sukkah, we would ask, is it customary for a queen to reside in a small sukkah whose area is less than 4 cubits squared? Right? 4 cubits squared, so 4 cubits by 4 cubits. So we're also going to be discussing today the minimum area of the sukkah. We've talked about the height of the sukkah. What about the minimum area? How big does a sukkah need to be in terms of its floor space for it to count as a sukkah? The answer, one suggestion is, well, it's 4 by 4 cubits. Okay, so 4 by 4 cubits is like 6 feet by 6 feet. That is a pretty small sukkah. Does a queen reside in such a small sukkah? Maybe it's only with regard to a very small sukkah that Rabbi Yehuda and the other rabbis argued about the height. If it's 20 cubits above the ground in such a tiny sukkah, forget about it. Of course, you totally lose awareness of the roof if it's that high when the walls are so close to you. And Rabba Bar Rav Ada said, this ruling is necessary only in the case of a sukkah that is constructed with several small rooms. Now, I've never even been in such a sukkah. All the sukkahs that I've been in, it's one room, right? It's just the walls and the roof. But maybe there's a sukkah that actually has partitions within the sukkah, a really large sukkah, and then inner partitions within the sukkah so that there's rooms within the sukkah. Now, what about that kind of a place? So Rabba Bar Rav Ada is suggesting that the sukkah was large, Queen Helene's sukkah was large, but it was subdivided into many small rooms, each of which was smaller than the required 4 square cubits. So again, the Gemara asks, is it then customary for a queen to reside in a sukkah constructed with several small rooms without leaving at least one large room in which she could assemble her family and servants? And Rav Ashi said this ruling is necessary only with regard to the compartments in the sukkah. It was indeed a large sukkah with a large central room. However, there were some small rooms adjacent to the main room, and it is with regard to this type of sukkah that there is a dispute between the rabbis of the Mishnah. The rabbis hold her sons were residing in a full-fledged sukkah with a large room, which everyone agrees was fit. However, she, the queen, often resided in the small rooms due to modesty to avoid being in the public eye. And for that reason, the elders did not say anything to her, as even if the small rooms were too small relative to the height of the sukkah, and they were therefore unfit, it didn't count as a sukkah in those rooms, but there was no problem since only she was in those rooms, and she's a woman, and she's not obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah. Her sons, who are obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah, when they were fulfilling the mitzvah of sukkah, were in the large room, which was a fit room. And Rabbi Yehuda holds her sons would occasionally reside with her in the small room, and even so the elders did not say anything to her, indicating that a sukkah more than 20 cubits high is fit even in a small sukkah. But now that the Tosefta can be explained according to all statements cited by the rabbis of the Gemara in the name of Rav, no proof can be cited with regard to the essence of the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis with regard to a small sukkah more than 20 cubits high. And the final outcome of this is that the limit on the height of a sukkah is 20 cubits. The Rabbi Yehuda was overruled by the other rabbis, and his argument that some elders didn't speak out or rebuke Queen Helene when she had a sukkah that was more than 20 cubits high is not dispositive of anything. There might have been all these other circumstances that would explain why the sages who visited her in that sukkah didn't say anything. Perhaps there was a fit portion of that sukkah which her sons occupied, and enough said. We're actually going to move on. Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said, the law is that one's sukkah must be large enough to hold his head and most of his body and his table. So now we're going to start talking about the area of the sukkah, not the height of the roofing, but how much space there is in the sukkah itself. So Rabbi Abba said to him in astonishment, in accordance with whose opinion did you rule? Was it in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai, the followers of Shammai? This is the subject of a dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and according to Beis Hillel, it is sufficient for the sukkah to be large enough to hold one's head and most of his body, and it need not be large enough to hold his table as well. Right? When we fulfill the mitzvah, the commandment to dwell in the sukkah during Sukkot, what does it mean? Right? It means that we'll go in there and we eat in there, and ideally that we sleep in there. So you would think it would have to have enough room for your table that you're going to eat on in there. But Beis Hillel said it's enough that your head and your upper body fits in the sukkah, even if you can't get a table in there. And in fact, that is the law, and it ended up being used during, there's a famous story, I can't remember which rabbi it was, a 20th century rabbi during the communist oppression of the Jews in Soviet Russia, who was sent to Siberia and was not allowed to practice Judaism, and it was Sukkot. And he made a tiny little sukkah, basically between two chairs with just a branch of leaves on top. And it was literally enough for him to just crouch in there under the roof and eat some food so he could say the blessing and fulfill that mitzvah. It really was the size of the Beis Hillel requirement. But Beis Shammai apparently say you have to have enough room for your table. Now, with regard to this dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, we're going to be analyzing it in much greater depth. I want to remind you that we've encountered this debate between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai before, and we encountered it on one of the most famous rulings in the Talmud. It was in Tractate Eruvin on page 13 on the B side. And this is really, really one of the most famous teachings in the Talmud, which is usually summarized as Elu ve'elu. These and these, meaning that there were disputes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai on many issues of law, and they were becoming very bitter arguments, and it was it was sort of heading to be some kind of a civil war and a split among the Jewish people. It was going to be a terrible thing. And then a voice from heaven came and said, these and these are the words of the living God, but the law follows Beis Hillel. Why? Because Beis Hillel were easy and not overbearing. And what's more, they stated the opinions of their opponents, Beis Shammai, before their own. Now, Nina and I often teach that as a matter of civil discourse and even effective advocacy, that when you are trying to convince somebody of your point of view in an argument, you should state before you go to the substance of your argument, you should show that you have heard and understood what your opponents are saying, and you should state their point of view in a way that they will say, yes, that is my point of view, before you give your argument. Because now you've set the table, you're showing them that you've listened to them. Now you've set the table where they might listen to you. And even if you don't win the day, that day, and convince them to believe in what you believe in, you've still engaged in civil discourse and created that possibility. Now, that's something we've mentioned many, many times, and it's often brought up in all kinds of contexts in the Jewish world and even beyond. But on that page 13b, where the heavenly voice came and said the law follows, Beis Hillel because they state the arguments of Beis Shammai before their own, the next paragraph is an example of Beis Hillel doing that. And what is the example? It's about this law that we're discussing today about the size of a sukkah. So first, let me take us back there to Eruvin 13b. And I'll just read that story. So Rabbi Abba said that Shmuel said, for 3 years, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagreed. These said the law is in accordance with our opinion, and these said the law is in accordance with our opinion. Ultimately, a bas kol, a daughter of a voice, meaning a divine voice, emerged and proclaimed both these and these are the words of the living God. However, the halacha, the law, is in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel. And the Gemara asked, since both these and these are the words of the living God, why were Beis Hillel privileged to have the law established in accordance with their opinion? The reason is that they were agreeable and forbearing, showing restraint when affronted, and when they taught the law, they would teach both their own statements and the statements of Beis Shammai, and moreover, when they formulated their teachings and cited a dispute, they stated they gave over the statements of Beis Shammai before their own statements in deference to Beis Shammai. And then here's the example. As in the Mishnah that we learned, in the case of one whose head and most of his body were in the sukkah, but his table was in the house, Beis Shammai deem this sukkah unfit, and Beis Hillel deem it fit. Beis Hillel said to Beis Shammai, wasn't there an incident in which the elders of Beis Shammai and the elders of Beis Hillel went to visit Rabbi Yochanan ben HaChoranit, and they found him sitting with his head and most of his body in the sukkah, but his table was in the house. And now this is Beis Hillel quoting the story, saying, and Beis Shammai said to them, from where do you seek to adduce a proof? Those visitors too said to him, if that was the manner in which you were accustomed to perform the mitzvah, you have never fulfilled the mitzvah of Sukkah in all your days. And it is apparent from the phrasing of the Mishnah that when the sages of Beis Hillel related that the elders of Beis Shammai and the elders of Beis Hillel visited Rabbi Yochanan ben HaChoranit, they mentioned the elders of Beis Shammai before their own elders. Right? So it's this Mishnah, this teaching that we're discussing now that is used as the example in that very famous argument back in Eruvin 13b about the proper way to advocate and to discuss and to dispute and to cite a law even after you've received the ruling in your favor is to give over the minority opinion, the one you disagree with, even before your own. So now we come back and discuss it here in Tractate Sukkah. Okay, so this is the subject of a dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And according to Beis Hillel, it is sufficient for the sukkah to be large enough to hold one's head and most of his body. It need not be large enough to hold his table as well. And the halakhic ruling that you issued is in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai, despite the fact that in disputes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel. And Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak said to him, well, rather, in accordance with whose opinion should I rule? Yes, my ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai, because in this case, that is the law, according to Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak. So some say that the exchange between these rabbis was slightly different. Rabbi Abba said, who stated that opinion to you? And Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak said to him, it was Beis Shammai, and nevertheless do not budge from it, as that is the established law. Based on either version of the exchange, there is a dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel with regard to the minimum measure of a small sukkah. Now we're going to continue this debate as it's listed here in Tractate Sukkah. But let's just look at how the law was established eventually. A sukkah must be large enough to contain the head, most of the body, and at least part of the table of the person sitting in the sukkah. So that is the way Hillel put it, right? That's the way that Beis Shammai said it. So Beis Shammai did prevail that the table must be in there, or at least part of the table. There's going to be a lot more nuance to this halacha as we get into it. So therefore, the sukkah must measure 7 by 7 hand breadths. This ruling is in accordance with Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak, who ruled in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai, right? So it was important that Beis Hillel stated the opinion of Beis Shammai before their own, because even though generally speaking the law follows Beis Hillel, in this instance it does follow Beis Shammai, and thank God that ruling was preserved through the manner of argument and citing laws of Beis Hillel, which brought along the opinions of their opponents. Because in fact, in this case, Beis Shammai is right. Why? So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak strongly objects to this assumption. From where do you conclude that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagree with regard to the minimum measure of a small sukkah. Perhaps it is with regard to a large sukkah. There's no size issue that they disagree. And in a case where one is sitting at the entrance of the sukkah and his table is inside the house, right? So are Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel arguing about the size of a sukkah, that it must be big enough to contain the head, the upper body, and at least part of the table? And if it's smaller than that, is an unfit sukkah? Or were they arguing about a sukkah that was certainly large enough, there was no minimum size issue, but rather that the table of the person was partially in the sukkah and partially out of the sukkah? Maybe they were arguing that the whole table needs to be inside the sukkah. Right? The law ends up being that just part of the table needs to be inside the sukkah, and perhaps that's what Beis Hillel is saying. So let's keep reading. So according to Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, so he says maybe they were just arguing about the position of the table in a large sukkah. As Beis Shammai hold that we issue a decree to prohibit one from sitting that way, right, where he's in the sukkah with a part of his table in the sukkah, but the rest of his table is outside of the sukkah. And perhaps Beis Shammai says you can't do that. We prohibit that. Why? Because the person might be drawn after his table while eating, to the extent that his head and most of his body will be inside the house, or meaning outside the sukkah. And Beis Hillel hold that we do not issue that decree, right? So it might be that if most of his table is outside the sukkah, Beis Shammai might say, no, that's no good. Because, he might get up and switch seats during the meal, and now he's still sitting at his table, but he's no longer sitting in the sukkah. And we don't want him to end up in that situation where he thinks he's fulfilling the mitzvah to dwell in the sukkah by eating his meal there, but he's not even in the sukkah because most of the table is out of the sukkah and he ends up sitting on the other part of the table. And Beis Hillel don't issue such a fence around the Torah, such a preventive decree, because we're not worried about that. He's in the sukkah now. He's eating his meal in the sukkah. He sat there on purpose. And so we're not going to say that this is prohibited, because the fact is he's in his sukkah and he's eating his meal in the sukkah. So we don't know what exactly Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai were arguing about. Were they arguing about his position around the table in a large enough sukkah, or were they arguing about the minimum size of the sukkah? The Gemara says, the language of the Mishnah is also precise, as it teaches, in the case of one whose head and most of his body were in the sukkah, and his table was in the house. So you can imagine this is like a sukkah attached to a house, right? And that's why you could have the table partially in the sukkah and partially in the house. It's attached to the house, meaning that the roof over the sukkah is not the roof of the house. It has to have that special roofing that lets light through. But you could use one wall of the house to be one of the walls of the sukkah, and that wall could have an opening in it, and the table could be partially in the sukkah and partially in the house. So that might be the situation. So in the case of one whose head and most of his body were in the sukkah and his table was in the house, Beis Shammai deem it unfit and Beis Hillel deem it fit. And if it is so that the dispute is with regard to the minimum measure of the sukkah rather than the position of the table, then the formulation of the Mishnah is missing the essential point. The distinction between a sukkah that holds and a sukkah that does not hold his head and most of his body is what the Mishnah needed to say. Since the Mishnah does not make that distinction, it doesn't talk about whether there's enough room for his head and most of his body. Rather, it talks about whether, him and his table are in the sukkah or not. Since it doesn't talk about the capacity, we would think that this Mishnah is not about the minimum size of the sukkah, but rather the position of the table, says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, and says now this discussion in the Gemara. But the Gemara goes on and questions this conclusion. And in the case of a small sukkah, do Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel not disagree? But isn't it taught in a different baraisa, a sukkah that holds his head and most of his body, and his table is fit? And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says it is unfit until it measures at least 4 cubits by 4 cubits. So now we're saying, okay, our Mishnah doesn't talk about the capacity of the sukkah, but there's a different contemporaneous teaching, a baraisa, which does talk about the capacity of the sukkah. And it says that if it holds his body and his head and most of his body and his table, then it is fit. But Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says it is unfit until it measures at least 4 cubits by 4 cubits. Definitely talking about minimum area. And it is taught in yet another baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says any sukkah that does not have an area of at least 4 cubits by 4 cubits is unfit. And the rabbis say even if it holds only his head and most of his body, it is fit. However, the term his table is not taught in this baraisa. If so, these two sources from the period of the Mishnah contradict each other, as each attributes a different opinion to the rabbis. So rather, must one not conclude from it that this baraisa, in which his table is included, is in accordance with the opinion of Beis Shammai, while that baraisa, in which his table is not included, is in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel? Apparently, they do dispute the minimum measure of a small sukkah. And Mar Zutra said, and the language of the Mishnah is also precise, and it indicates that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel indeed dispute the minimum measure of a small sukkah from the fact that it teaches Beis Shammai deem it unfit and Beis Hillel deem it fit. And if it is so that the dispute is with regard to the conduct of one sitting at the entrance of a large sukkah, meaning where his table is placed, then Beis Shammai say he did not fulfill his obligation, and Beis Hillel say he fulfilled his obligation. That's what the Mishnah needed to say. But since the Mishnah didn't say he fulfilled his obligation or he didn't fulfill his obligation, rather they said the sukkah is fit or the sukkah is unfit, this indicates that the dispute is with regard to the halakhic status of the sukkah itself and not with regard to the behavior of the person sitting in it. So the Gemara asks, but if that is so, the formulation of the Mishnah, one whose head and most of his body were in the sukkah, is difficult, as it indicates that the dispute is with regard to where in the sukkah he was sitting. The Mishnah does not say a sukkah that holds his head and most of his body, which would indicate that the dispute is with regard to the minimum measure of the sukkah. So the Gemara answers, actually, they disagree with regard to two issues. They disagree with regard to the minimum measure of a small sukkah, and they disagree with regard to where one may sit in a large sukkah. And the Mishnah is incomplete, and this is what it is teaching. One whose head and most of his body were in the sukkah, and his table was in the house, Beis Shammai say that he did not fulfill his obligation, and Beis Hillel say that he did fulfill his obligation. And with regard to a sukkah that holds only his head and most of his body, Beis Shammai deem it unfit and Beis Hillel deem it fit. In this way, the dispute in the Mishnah is understood as relating to the measure of a small sukkah and the manner in which one fulfills his obligation in a large sukkah. So that's how we finally come to understand that there are two disagreements between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel say it's enough if you if you are sitting and eating in your sukkah, even if your table is not there. Beis Shammai say your table has to be there too. Beis Hillel say a sukkah is fit if it's enough to hold you and your upper body while you're eating there. Beis Shammai say a sukkah is not fit until it holds you, your your head, your upper body, and the table, at least part of the table at which you are eating. We move on. Now, we're going to skip the next section, which is going to be discussing and so from where is it derived that the minimum measure of a sukkah is 4 by 4 cubits? Is that how much room you need for your head and your upper body? No, that actually ends up getting the minimum measure is 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths for that. But this 4 by 4 cubits is used for some other rulings. So that's going to be compared to a house. How big must a structure be called a house? So we digress from the law of sukkah to the law of a house. Why does it matter? What is the minimum measure of a house? And these days there are these tiny houses, right? Tiny houses. And there probably are some tiny houses that are maybe 6 feet by 6 feet is a small house indeed. But according to the sages, if a house is less than 6 feet by 6 feet, it is not deemed a house in terms of what? A whole bunch of laws. If it's less than 6 feet by 6 feet, it's not a house and it doesn't need a mezuzah. If it's less than 6 feet by 6 feet, it's not a house, and therefore it doesn't need a parapet on its roof up above. There's a law in the Torah that the roof of your house must have a guardrail lest a person go up there and fall off. And it's your responsibility to put up safety rails on the roof of your house. But if the house is less than 4 cubits by 4 cubits, it's not a house. You're exempt from that. Houses can contract sara'as, biblical leprosy. We've talked about that before, and we'll talk about it again further on in our journey. But again, a house that's less than 6 feet by 6 feet is not a house, and so that law will not apply. And transfers of homes within walled cities, that law doesn't apply if it's less than 6 feet by 6 feet. And somebody who's just built a new house and is going off to war, when they say to him, anybody who just got married, go home. Anybody who just built a house, go home. But if the house that he built is less than 6 feet by 6 feet, he didn't build a house. He can't go home. And so there's going to be a lot of discussion of that law and derivation of that law. We're going to go to the bottom of the B side of page 3 and pick it up here and then go on to the A side of page 4. With regard to the law in the Mishna that a sukkah more than 20 cubits high is unfit, the Gemara states, if the sukkah was more than 20 cubits high and one comes to diminish its height by placing cushions and blankets on the floor, right? So let's say it's 21 cubits high, so that's an unfit sukkah. But then you put a bunch of blankets and cushions on the floor of the sukkah that's at least, 1 cubit thick. So now it brings the roof within 20 cubits of the floor, right? You've raised the floor with these cushions and blankets. So have you made it a fit sukkah? And one comes to diminish its height by placing cushions and blankets on the floor. It is not a decrease of the height with halakhic significance. It does not render the sukkah fit. Why? Because in that case, one is concerned that the bedding will be ruined, and therefore one does not intend to leave it there very long. Like, you don't leave those cushions and blankets there throughout the whole holiday because people are going to be walking over it. It might need to be cleaned. They might get ruined, so you might remove them. And once you remove them, that's an unfit sukkah. So you can't assume that the cushions and blankets are going to be there the whole time. And even though he nullified all the cushions and blankets, intending that for the duration of the festival, the halakhic status of these cushions and blankets is nothing more than that of the dirt underneath them, it is still not deemed a fit nullification because his intention is rendered irrelevant by the opinions of all other people. People do not typically do this, and so the action of one who does is discounted. But if one placed straw on the floor of his sukkah in order to diminish its height, and he verbally nullified it by saying out loud that he will not use the straw for any other purpose, then he has decreased the height of the sukkah by raising the floor, using straw on the floor, and now the sukkah is fit. And the same is true, and all the more so, if he placed dirt on the sukkah floor and nullified it, right? If he raised the floor by adding a bunch of dirt, of course he's planning to leave that dirt all the time there. He did it in order to raise the floor so that the distance between the floor and the roofing would be less than 20 cubits, and this would be deemed fit. The sukkah is fit. If a sukkah was more than 20 cubits high, but the ends of the palm leaves fall within 20 cubits, then the following distinction applies. So the primary roofing is more than 20 cubits high, but some of the leaves hang down, right? And I've definitely been in sukkahs where they use palm fronds rather than rolls of bamboo slats, which is sort of like the purchased way, but kind of more authentic and traditional ways, just to have some beams up there to hold it up and then cover it with like palm fronds. And the palm fronds will very likely hang down between the beams. And maybe they will hang down the ends of the fronds lower than 20 cubits above the floor. So has that made it, do we now have a fit sukkah? Depends. The following distinction applies. If the shade that is provided solely by the leaves which are within 20 cubits of the ground is greater than the sunlight in the sukkah, it is fit. But if most of the shade that the roofing is provided is actually being provided by palm fronds that are more than 20 cubits above the ground, then the sukkah is not fit. And the Gemara applies this same principle to the opposite case. In a case where the sukkah was only 10 handbreadths high. So yesterday we taught that a sukkah has a maximum height, the roofing can't be more than 20 cubits above the ground, and a minimum height, that the roofing must be at least 10 handbreadths above the ground, so about waist high on an average person. Where am I? Okay, so wait a minute, where am I? So if the sukkah was only 10 handbreadths high, the minimum height for a fit sukkah, but the ends of the palm leaves fall within the 10 handbreadths, Abaye thought to say that the same calculation applies here. If the sunlight in the sukkah is greater than the shade provided by the leaves that are within 10 handbreadths of the ground, meaning that those leaves do not constitute a fit sukkah on their own, then the sukkah would be fit, right? If most of the shade is provided by leaves that are more than 10 handbreadths above the ground, it's a fit sukkah. But if most of the shade is provided by palm fronds that are less than 10 handbreadths above the ground, then it would be an unfit sukkah. Rava said to him, the calculation does not apply in this particular case, as if the branches fall within 10 handbreadths of the ground, that is considered a sagging residence, and a person does not reside in a sagging residence. Therefore, cannot even be considered a temporary residence. It is no good as a sukkah. The sages will then have a discussion, which we're going to skip, about a different way of building up the ground. Instead of adding dirt to the whole floor of the sukkah, or adding hay, which would work, or adding blankets and pillows all around the floor at the base of the sukkah, which we said would not work, what if he built a platform on the floor of the sukkah? Now, if that platform, sort of like a wooden floor above the dirt floor, if it covered the entire floor of the sukkah, great, no problem. If it raises the floor within 20 cubits of the ceiling, we're all good. But what if that platform only occupied part of the sukkah, right? So part of the floor of the sukkah is within 20 cubits of the roofing, and part of the floor is not, is more than 20 cubits away from the roofing. What then is the law? So if you have a platform along the side of the sukkah, this is the law, if one built a platform with a surface area sufficient for a fit sukkah, along one of the side walls of the sukkah, which was and the sukkah was more than 20 cubits high, and the distance between the edge of the platform and the opposite wall is less than 4 cubits, then the area of the platform alone constitutes a fit sukkah. What if you put a platform in the middle of the sukkah? If one built a platform, but it doesn't reach the walls, if one built a platform with a surface area sufficient for a fit sukkah in the center of the sukkah, and the distance between the edge of the platform to the surrounding walls is less than 4 cubits, it is fit. And this is true even if the platform is more than 10 handbreadths high. But if the platform in the middle of the sukkah is really in the middle and its edges of the platform don't come within 4 cubits of the walls, then this is not a fit sukkah. We're near the bottom of the A side of page 4. If the sukkah was less than 10 handbreadths high, it was too low, the roofing is too low, and he dug out an area inside the sukkah. So now instead of raising the floor, he's going to lower the floor by digging out the floor, digging a hole in the floor. And he dug out an area inside the sukkah in order to complete the requisite height of the sukkah to 10 handbreadths. If from the edge of the dugout area to the wall there is a distance of 3 handbreadths, it is unfit, as in that case the edge of the dugout area is not joined to the wall of the sukkah. Therefore, even though the interior space is 10 handbreadths high, its walls are not the requisite height to be considered a fit sukkah. But if the distance from the edge of the dugout area, the hole in the middle, to the wall was less than 3 handbreadths, then it is fit, as we use the concept of lavud, that things which are less than 3 handbreadths apart are joined. So the walls of the sides of the hole in the middle of the sukkah, which are less than 3 handbreadths away from the walls of the sukkah, combine with the wall as if it's one wall, which is now more than 10 handbreadths high, and it would be fit. And the Gemara asks, what is different there? In the case of a sukkah with a platform in its center, that you said that it is a fit sukkah if the wall is at a distance of less than 4 cubits from the edge of the platform. And what is different here that you said that where there's a hole in the bottom of the sukkah, that it needs to, that the sides of the hole have to be less than 3 handbreadths away from the wall. In the platform, it's enough if it's within 4 cubits of the wall, but with a hole in the middle, it has to be within 3 handbreadths of the wall. And the Gemara answers, there, in the case of the sukkah, more than 20 cubits high, where there is already a wall, but it is removed from the platform, as long as the wall is at a distance of less than 4 cubits, it is sufficient to render the sukkah fit because you have a legitimate wall. But here, where the sukkah is less than 10 handbreadths high, its wall is not a fit wall. In order to render it a wall by adding the height of the dugout area, if the distance between them is less than 3 handbreadths, yes, the dugout area is considered to be part of the wall, and now you have a wall that's at least 10 handbreadths high. And so what we're talking about here is that for a wall, it's not just the height of the roofing. The reason that the minimum height of the roofing is 10 handbreadths is not so much the height of the roofing as the fact that you have to have a wall which is at least 10 handbreadths high. And a wall that is less than 10 handbreadths high is not a wall. It doesn't count as a wall. So now your sukkah would have no walls, and that's the problem. So you need the walls to be at least 10 handbreadths high. You need the roofing to be at least 20 cubits, to be no more than 20 cubits from the ground. It's actually an important distinction. There's a maximum height of the roofing to the ground. There's a minimum height of the walls of the sukkah. It's not so much the distance from the roofing to the ground as it is the height of the walls. And that's actually all I wanted to cover today. So let me come to your comments and questions. By the way, I'm wearing a new t-shirt. I have a green one like this that I've worn before. Whenever I wear my Yid shirt, somebody out there says, I can't believe you're wearing that. You know, Yid is a derogatory term for Jews. And my answer is very important, and you need to know this if you think that this is an offensive shirt. Yid is what we call ourselves. Yid is Jew in Yiddish, right? How could the word that we call ourselves, I am a Yid, I'm a proud Yid, I'm a happy Yid. I am so honored and privileged that God allowed me to be born a Jew, or somebody else who converted to become a Jew. We are Yidden. That's a plural of Yid. It's wonderful to be a Yid, and the fact that some Jew haters in history might use the word Jew or the word Yid to describe a people that they hate because they're anti-Semites and they're jerks and who cares what they think, is no reason that we would avoid calling ourselves what we call ourselves in our own language. And these shirts are available in our store, shop.accidentaltalmudist.org. All right, let's come to your questions. Steve, the form of debate, argument, resolution between the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel is one more thing we can carry with us every day. We agree strongly. Bill, I think even most tiny homes would qualify as houses under the Torah. I recently went on a tear researching them for something, and the smallest that I saw was 6 feet by 8 feet. So there you go. It's bigger than 4 cubits by 4 cubits. Thank you, Bill. And Steve says, I wonder what the average height for a Jew was 2,000 years ago. Great question. I don't know. But definitely, we know that there were very tall people in the world. I don't know about Jews. Are there any? I guess Samson was described as very large. Definitely Goliath, not a Jew, but a very large person. And King, right? Og, right? Og, the king, was described as like such a giant that his bed was so large. There were large people. We think that like life expectancy has grown so much, and it's probably true, that the average peasant living in the Dark Ages had a terrible diet and didn't have medicine, and the average life expectancy was shorter than it is today. Nevertheless, Moses lived to 120. A lot of people, even not talking in the age of Methuselah and the people who lived 900 years, But later than that, when the lifespans were more typical to ours, like later books of the Bible, we still have people living 80, 90, 100 years, 110 years, 120 years. So how does that relate to size? I don't know. But at some point we'll encounter discussion of how big people actually are. I don't have an answer for you. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular time for just one page here in Tractate Sukkah. The regular time is 6 p.m. Pacific. All the best. Take care.